In 1720, the richest country in the world destroyed itself in 8 months. Not by war, not by famine, by a single stock. In January, shares in the South Sea Company sold for £128. By June, they hit £1,000. By December, they were worth almost nothing. It was £500 billion in modern money. Gone. Thousands of families lost everything over. Members of parliament lost their savings. Army officers lost their pension. Widows lost their only inheritance. Even Isaac Newton, the smartest man alive, lost the equivalent of $4 million. He later said, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." Here's the part that makes no sense. The South Sea Company had no real business. It had never turned a profit. Its trade routes didn't exist. And the men running it knew that from day one. This wasn't a company that failed. This was a con, designed, engineered, and executed at the highest levels of the British government. And it worked. So how did a company selling nothing collapse an entire empire? It started not with greed, but with a war England couldn't afford to lose. It's 1711. England has just spent a decade fighting France in the War of the Spanish Succession. The war is over. But the bill is not. The British government owes £10 million in war debt. In today's money, that's roughly 12 billion. Parliament is desperate. They need someone to absorb that debt, fast. Enter John Blunt. Blunt is not a nobleman. He's not a banker. He's a scrivener's son from Rochester who taught himself finance from the ground up. And he has an idea. What if a private company took on the government's war debt? In exchange, the government would give that company a monopoly. Exclusive trading rights to Spanish colonies in South America. Ports full of silver, gold, and untapped market. At least, that was the pitch. The reality was very different. England and Spain were barely on speaking terms. The treaty allowing this trade was vague, limited, and full of restrictions. In practice, the South Sea Company was allowed to send exactly 1 ship per year to Spanish colonies. 1 ship for a year. That was the entire business model. But Blunt wasn't building a trading company. He was building a financial instrument. Here's how it worked. The government owed money to thousands of individual creditors, soldiers, suppliers, pensioners. Blunt offered those creditors a deal. Hand us your government debt. We'll give you South Sea Company stock instead. You'll own a piece of the most exciting company in England. The creditors said yes. Parliaments said yes. The king said yes. And the South Sea Company absorbed £20 billion in government debt overnight. Now Blunt had one problem. The stock was only valuable if people believed the company would make money. And the company was making almost nothing. So Blunt did what every great con man does. He manufactured belief. He hired publicists to plant stories in London newspaper. Wild, fabricated stories about mountains of South American gold. Secret trade deals worth millions. Treasure fleets already on their way to England. None of it was true. But in 1711, there was no fact-checking. There was no SEC. There were no financial disclosures. There was only the story, and Blunt told it brilliant. Investors flooded in. Merchants, doctors, clergy, aristocrats. Everyone wanted South Sea stock. And here's where Blunt got truly dangerous. He realized the stock price itself was the product, not the trade routes, not the ships, not the gold. The rising price was what he was selling. And to keep the price rising, he needed more buyers. To get more buyers, he needed the price to rise. You can see the problem. This is the exact structure of every Ponzi scheme ever built. Musical chairs, where the music keeps getting louder. But Blunt had one advantage most fraudsters don't. He had access to the most powerful men in England, so he used it. In 1720, the South Sea Company proposed its most audacious move yet. It would take over the entire national debt. Not just £10 million, all of it, £31 million off. The equivalent of the entire British government's annual income. To make this happen, Blunt needed Parliament to approve the deal. So he bribed them, not subtly, brazenly. Directors handed South Sea shares for free to government ministers. Shares worth thousands of pounds. No money changed hands. No paper trail. Just a quiet transfer of stock into a private account. The Chancellor of the Exchequer received shares. The Postmaster General received shares. Even members of the King's inner circle received shares. And Parliament approved the deal. But there was a problem nobody saw coming. The bribery was recorded. Not by a journalist. Not by a regulator. In the company's own private ledger. A ledger that still existed. A ledger that investigators would eventually find. But that was still 2 years away. For now, the approval sent the stock into the stratosphere. And Blunt was about to become the most celebrated man in England. By the spring of 1720, London had lost its mind. South Sea stock opened the year at £128 per share. By May, it hit £550. By June, £890. By August, £1,000. That is a 900% return in 8 months. To put that in perspective, the best hedge funds in modern history average 20% per year. South Sea investors were making that every 2 weeks. The excitement was unlike anything England had ever seen. People quit their jobs to trade full-time. Lawyers abandoned their practices. Doctors closed their offices. A member of Parliament wrote to his brother, "Everyone is engaged in buying and selling." Coffee houses turned into trading floors. Men crowded Exchange Alley so tightly they couldn't move. Women, who were largely excluded from formal finance, found ways in anyway. Countesses sent footmen to buy shares on their behalf. Wealthy widows mortgaged their estates. Even clergymen speculated with church funds. And at the center of all of it stood John Blunt. He was not a handsome man. He was not charming in the traditional sense. But he radiated certainty. And in a bubble, certainty is the most valuable commodity of all. He gave speeches promising shareholders untold return. He met privately with the king's mistresses, who had enormous political influence. He provided them shares at discounted prices. They whispered favorable things into royal ears. The king himself, George I, invested. When the King of England buys your stock, doubt becomes impossible. Newspapers called Blunt a financial visionary. Pamphlets compared him to a modern Midas. The company held lavish shareholder dinners in the grandest rooms in London. Crystal glasses, French wine, roasted meats, string quartet. Directors arrived in gilded carriages. And all the while, the stock kept climbing. Now here is the detail that should make your stomach turn. While ordinary people were selling their furniture to buy shares, while pensioners were gambling their only savings, John Blunt was quietly selling. Not publicly. Not in one large transaction that would spook the market. Slowly, carefully, share by share. Blunt knew exactly what the company was worth. He had always known. He was cashing out at £1,000 per share, while encouraging everyone else to buy at £1,000 per share. This is called selling to the public at the top. Every fraudster, from Bernie Madoff to the crypto bros of 2022, would later use this exact playbook. But Blunt wasn't the only one getting rich. The bubble created its own ecosystem of fraud. Within months of the South Sea surge, hundreds of copycat companies appeared. They were called bubble companies. Promoters would announce a new venture, often completely fictional, sell shares to excited investors, and vanish with the money. One company advertised itself as existing for a purpose to be announced later. It raised £2,000 in a single morning. The promoter was never seen again. Another company promised to import jackasses from Spain. Another claimed it could extract silver from lead. Another, and this one is real, promised investors a share in a wheel of perpetual motion. These weren't fringe operations. They raised millions combined. Because the South Sea bubble had created something more dangerous than a fraudulent company. It had created a culture of total credulity. When the market goes up forever, skepticism feels foolish. Doubt feels like a character flaw. And that's exactly where John Blunt wanted everyone. But there was one man watching all of this with deep suspicion. His name was Robert Walpole. He was a politician, not a financier. But he understood something the financial community had missed. No company on earth could justify a 900% rise in 8 months. Not with one ship per year. Not with a trade monopoly England couldn't enforce. Not with a war debt dressed up as an asset. Walpole stood up in Parliament and warned that the bubble would burst. He was laughed at. Directors publicly mocked him. The newspapers called him a fearmonger. Investors ignored him because the price was still going up, and in a bubble, price is truth. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a French investor named Richard Cantillon had done the math. He calculated that South Sea stock was trading at roughly 80 times the company's realistic earning. He quietly sold every share he owned. Then he shorted the stock, betting it would crash. He was right. But even he didn't know how fast it would happen. Because in August of 1720, something changed. One tiny, almost invisible crack appeared. And it was enough. The crack came from an unlikely place. Not a whistleblower. Not a regular. Not a journalist. The South Sea Company destroyed itself. Here's what happened. By August 1720, the directors had a problem. Too many bubble companies were competing for investor money. Every shilling spent on perpetual motion wheels was a shilling not spent on South Sea stock. So the directors did something catastrophically stupid. They lobbied Parliament to pass the Bubble Act. The Bubble Act made it illegal to form new joint stock companies without royal charter. It shut down hundreds of competitor bubble companies overnight. The directors thought this would funnel money back into South Sea stock. They were wrong. When the bubble companies collapsed, investors panicked. They didn't buy South Sea stock, they sold it. On August 31st, 1720, South Sea shares stood at 775.5. By September 12th, they had fallen to 520 pounds. By October 1st, they were at 290 pounds. By December, they hit 100 pounds. In 4 months, the stock lost 90% of its value. $100 billion and Alden wealth evaporated. The speed was breathtaking. Families who had mortgaged their homes to buy shares at £1,000 now held paper worth £100. They couldn't pay their mortgages. Banks that had lent money against South Sea stock as collateral were suddenly insolvent. The credit market froze. Merchants couldn't get loans. Businesses collapsed. the entire British financial system went into cardiac arrest. In the streets of London, the mood turned violent. Angry investors marched on Parliament. Windows were smashed. Death threats were sent to directors. One pamphlet circulated suggesting the directors be sewn into sacks with poisonous snake and thrown into the Thames. Parliament convened an emergency session. They needed answers. They needed someone to blame. And they were about to find more than they bargained for. An investigation was ordered immediately. A committee of MPs began subpoenaing company records. And that's when they found the ledger. The same private ledger that recorded every bribe, every backdated share transfer, every payment to every minister. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Asselby, was in the ledger. The Postmaster General, James Craggs the Elder, was in the ledger. The Secretary of State, James Craggs the Younger, was in the ledger. Even the King's mistresses were in the ledger. The corruption went higher than anyone had suspected. Parliament erupted. Members who had taken bribes sat listening to the evidence of their own crimes being read aloud. Some played innocent. Some wept. Some tried to flee. James Craggs the Elder didn't wait for the verdict. He died, allegedly of apoplexy, before he could be arrested. Some historians believe he took his own life. His son, Craggs the Younger, died of smallpox days later. Whether illness or something else, both men escaped justice by dying. John Asselby was less fortunate. He was arrested, tried, and expelled from Parliament in disgrace. His estates were seized. He became the first British Chancellor ever imprisoned for financial corruption. But the investigation wasn't finished. They came for the directors next. Most were arrested. Their personal assets were frozen immediately. Parliament passed a special act to claw back their profits. Of the £2 million in personal wealth held by South Sea directors, Parliament confiscated £1.8 million. John Blunt himself was brought before the committee. He sat in that chamber, the same chamber he had bribed, and answered for everything. Blunt tried to play dumb. He claimed he was merely executing the will of the shareholders. The committee didn't believe him. His estate was seized. His fortune, worth roughly £183,000 at the time, was stripped down to £1,000. A single £1,000. That was all they left him. Barely enough to survive on. The man who had engineered the greatest financial crime in British history was left with almost nothing. But here is the darkest detail of all. The king's accounts were never fully investigated. George I had profited from the bubble through his mistress's share allocation. But a sitting monarch cannot be put on trial. So that thread was quietly cut. The investigation stopped exactly where royal privilege began. And the investors, the thousands of families who had lost everything, received pennies on the pound in compensation. A widow who had invested her entire inheritance got back roughly 33% of what she lost. An army officer who had sold his commission to buy shares received nothing at all. The money was simply gone. And the men most responsible for taking it were either dead, protected by royal privilege, or had hidden enough offshore to survive comfortably. Sound familiar? It should. Because this story never really ended. It just changed its costume. The South Sea bubble didn't just destroy fortune. It destroyed trust. And in finance, trust is everything. For the next 130 years, the British government was so traumatized by what happened. New joint stock companies were effectively banned until 1825. 100 years of economic caution, triggered by 8 months of unchecked greed. The victims never fully recover. A parliamentary report estimated that ordinary investors lost the equivalent of billions in modern money. Most of that money was never returned. Families who had saved for generations were wiped out in weeks. One investor, a seamstress named Mary Carter, lost her entire life savings of £500. She wrote to Parliament begging for compensation. She received £30. Her letter still exists in the British National Archive. £30 for a life's work. Meanwhile, Robert Walpole, the man who had warned Parliament and been laughed at, rose to become Britain's first Prime Minister. He spent years cleaning up the wreckage, restructuring the debt, stabilizing the banks, rebuilding confidence in British finance. History vindicated him completely. The man the newspapers called a fearmonger became the father of modern British government. And John Blunt? He retired to Bath. With his £1,000 allowance, he lived quietly for another 13 years. He never apologized. He never admitted wrongdoing. He died in 1733, comfortable, anonymous, and free. No prison cell. No public shaming beyond the trial. Just a quiet life in a spa town while his victims rebuilt what they could. That detail has infuriated historians for 300 years. But here is what the South Sea Bubble actually gave us. It gave us the blueprint for how financial fraud works at scale. The pattern is always the same. A real asset gets inflated by manufactured belief. Insiders cash out while encouraging outsiders to buy in. Regulators are either bribed, ignored, or simply too slow. The crash is sudden, total, and irreversible. And the people who engineered it suffer least. We saw this in 1929. We saw it in Enron. We saw it in 2008. We saw it in FTX. The costumes changed. The asset changes. Tulips, railroads, mortgages, crypto. Story changes. But the structure is always identical to what John Blunt built in 1720. Which means the most important question isn't how the South Sea Bubble happened. It's why we keep letting it happen again. The answer is uncomfortable. Because the bubble always feels different from the inside. The stock is always going up. The future always looks real. The story always sounds convincing. And doubt always feels foolish. Until the morning it doesn't. 300 years later, the South Sea Bubble remains the single most important case study in financial history. Not because it was the biggest, not because it was the most sophisticated, but because it was the first time the world learned that a story, told convincingly enough, can be worth more than the thing it describes. And that lesson has never stopped being true. And that's how one fictional trade route broke the British Empire and built the foundation of every financial con that came after it.